My name is Samira Yamin. I'm an artist. I work with war photography mostly. I do not make war photos. I take them from Time magazine almost exclusively. So my work is mostly a critique of the way that images are used to represent and narrate sort of a nebulous Middle East as a place of turmoil, conflict, and almost exclusively as a place of conflict. The work is very much about photography, but because it's coming from the magazine, it's dealing also with materiality, so the page itself is really important to me. To date with these projects, I've always used the actual pages themselves. I don't make copies of the images. They are themselves already copies in some way because it's a reproducible object, so or a reproduced object, so I like to just use it as it is, and it's very important to me. And it's also really important to me to kind of leave the photos often with their with their text and with their headlines. And in a lot of the work you can see, because the pages are so thin, you can see through them and see what's on the back of a page. Sometimes ads show in my work, and all of that it's just part of the object. It's part of the way the narrative is articulated, and so I want it to live very much in its own context. I want to think about how photography is used in this way, in this manner, to in the form of a magazine that arrives on your doorstep once a week. I like thinking about the object that I like to say that Time magazine is a thing you read while you're waiting for something else to happen. What's really interesting for me about Time magazine is it seems to be, my interpretation of it at the very least, is that it's very much intended for Americans abroad, more so than for readers. It's produced always in English, and if you look at the sides of the international editions, it has the prices of individual countries, and a lot of them are military bases, and so it's very much intended for Americans abroad, I think, to know about what's going on in the in the U.S. Or how the Americans are interpreting abroad. It also, I think, functions as a way of exporting and articulating an American narrative abroad, right? So even if you're not an American but you're living in another country, and again, even the word abroad, right, situates us exactly here in the U.S. So it means that we're here and everywhere else is there, everywhere else is abroad, right? So it's very much built into the structure of how the magazine is made and then distributed. These are the earlier works, and the one on the left, the Stop Obsessing About Iran, that's the first of the cutouts that I ever made. The magazine, I think of the magazine as it's a structuring device in and of itself, right? It's a frame. It's a structure that takes a week's worth of chaos, right? So all this stuff happens in the world. There's a structure here. That structure can be known and it can be articulated. This is how, right? So that kind of there's a knowing that happens of the world, right, through putting this magazine together. The patterns, which come from Islamic architecture, they're Islamic sacred geometries. The patterns are doing a very similar thing. They take, and religion, all religions do this, and that's the function of religion, is it takes a chaotic world and it says, no, 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 there's a system here. That system is knowable and it's representable. In this case, it's represented in these patterns, right? So this is a representation of the universe as a place of structure. That is what religion does, and it does it in this particular patterned way. And a lot of religions, maybe most religions, have a pattern-based way of representing the universe, and the reason is because it's repeated, it's infinite, right? It's edgeless. The world is infinite, right? What we do when we're framing, right? The white walls, the photography, the page, these are all, framing devices. When we're framing, we're actually choosing the edge of the world that we want to look at, right? In every single photograph, there is an infinite universe not contained. So it's the same thing of taking a repeating pattern that goes on infinitely and choosing to let it end somewhere, which happens to also be the edge of the page of the photograph, for example. And so I specifically choose to, let the patterns go to the edge of the photos only, as if the text is overlaid onto the universe, right? So the photo is cropping the universe to here, but that it could keep going. And so I'm borrowing that function of the patterns in order to use it to look inside that universe, right? To see, as opposed to seeing the content of the photograph, I actually want to see the structure of it. So if we go back to the Stop Obsessing About Iran piece, the way I make these, they're all handmade on a light box. And so when I was working on this one piece, I just had an idea. It was like an inkling of an idea. What if I put these things together? I did, and it was all on, on a light box. So it was backlit, which means I can't actually see the photo while I'm working on it, which is an interesting thing to think about psychologically, like why I would be making all this work that's constantly taking content out. And even while I'm making it, it's I'm not allowing myself to see the photo. And as someone who works with war photography, these are questions I need to be asking myself, even if the work isn't about that overtly. But so in this case, when I turned the light off, I noticed that the missile from the photograph is almost centered, but just not quite. And you're not supposed to know that. We're not supposed to see that. But once you start seeing the way the image is actually structured against, and then this line is put in here, right? And there's just a slight break here. These are tiny little details that whether or not the editor and the layout designer of the magazine and, all the people that are involved in making the final object, whether they're doing it consciously or not, I don't actually really care. What I'm more interested in is the end result. What I'm doing here now, and that's why there's an overlay, right? It's still the page itself. It's still the scale of the magazine that you open, right, at the dentist's office. Or the object that arrives on your doorstep every day. It's still the thing itself. The difference here is that I'm overlaying, yes, the glass, and I'm asking then, I'm putting the responsibility on the viewer to take critical and dynamic positions with respect to it. That you should not be able to just turn the page here. That it should require a bodily investment. It should require a viewer-directed, a reader-directed choreography, right? I'm not going to tell you how to look at it. It's not really about, there's not a particular choreography that reveals something. But if you want to have a relationship to every single subject of this photograph, every individual life that's represented, maybe it requires a tiny bit of movement. And so here it's actually kind of, a 3/4 inch space. And it's carved glass, it's optical glass, and so it refracts really nicely. And so a face can be in multiple places at once. It just requires that the viewer and the reader take multiple positions in order to see different aspects of it, and that there is no one stance that resolves it. That each position might give you another piece of information, but to know and to have experienced this photograph at the very least, let alone the subjects, each individual person on this raft is not something that can be done just by standing in one place. And the patterns actually they come from what's called dynamic symmetry. So they're not random. And so that's actually an interesting thing to think about as well. We think of symmetry, if you think about the page, right, it's folded in half, right? We think of symmetry as vertical and horizontal. And so the way that it's made is it's based not on the horizontal and the vertical lines, but on the diagonal. And so what you have is the diagonal, and every diagonal has two reciprocals. And what a reciprocal is, and this is where it gets very mathy, geometric again, I should say, because these are, right, geometry is all about relationships, about proportions, about the way things relate to one another in the world. And the magazine is a relation, right? Photography is a relation. So the diagonal has two reciprocals which are perpendicular, it's still based on the 90 degrees, to an opposite corner. And so what this line is it's the reciprocal of the other diagonal. And so I took one diagonal and one reciprocal, and when I put it onto the exact page, I found that all of the figures, all of the subjects fell exactly within that space. For people that want to pursue a career in the arts and to be artists, I would give the same advice about perseverance and what perseverance is. Perseverance is knowing why you're doing it, even if it's to say I love doing it and that's the reason I'm doing it. But knowing why, deciding why every day you come into the studio, every time you sit down at your desk with whatever it is you're working with, whether it's at home or in, wherever you are, knowing why you're sitting down to do it, because there are no right answers. Nobody's going to tell you that you made this painting right or wrong. You have to decide that for yourself. And that's how work happens in the studio. That's how art happens, is asking a question, working through it, and deciding when the work may or may not be done, how to move from one piece to the next, which questions to ask. These things, there's nobody telling you what to do. That's all coming from you. So you have to be able to, develop the skill of asking yourself, why am I doing this every time? That the only place to do it is in the studio. And that's sometimes my problem. So I want to be a scientist. I want to be a historian. I want to be a writer. I want to be a painter. I want to be everything. The only place I know of to be everything is in the studio, is as an artist. That's why I do it.